Boom. Good evening. No, good morning. It's Tuesday, the 12th of December, and we're on the second and concluding part of reading the contract with America. We left off yesterday with the third founding format, or the third founding foundation, judicial reform, and today we're going to conclude with constitutional amendment, police reform, entertainment reform, monuments, and black responsibility. Part 4, judicial or constitutional amendment codifying the expansion of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is the first of the Civil War amendments. 13th Amendment was passed in December of 1865. It is the date that slavery officially ended or supposedly ended in the United States. It wasn't Juneteenth. It was December the 13th, 1865, when slavery ended. If you want to celebrate any date with any amendment, with any celebration, it should be December 13th, not Juneteenth. But that's my feeling. The amendment will abolish slavery. The amendment will abolish slavery in any form, including as a punishment for crime allowed by the 13th Amendment for prison inmates. It will further declare unconstitutional any government-run system, including justice, policing, education, health, and welfare, that does not provide services on an equal basis to all citizens and communities. If provided public services fail to meet minimum standards, they will be considered on their face unconstitutional unless proven special circumstances. It reverses the burden of proof to those in non-compliance instead of civil rights lawyers having to prove the systems are racist. You don't have to prove systems are racist because history has proven that systems in this country, institutions, are indeed racist. While courts have expanded the interpretation of the 13th Amendment to provide some of these rights, this amendment will eliminate any uncertainty. Next, of course, is the extended foundational element of the contract with Black America, police reform. Qualified immunity will be eliminated. That's basically legislation to fundamentally reverse the Supreme Court case of Plumhoff versus Ricard, 572 U.S. 765, which was rendered in 2014, in which immunity was upheld. Before legislation is passed, the Democratic Party should oppose qualified immunity when the official party platform is drafted in August. This will pressure urban mayors or mayors throughout this country to instruct city attorneys not to assert qualified immunity as an affirmative defense. Police lawyers can argue why they should not be charged because they acted in good faith, but the presumption must be reversed. Second point, mandatory malpractice insurance to be carried by police officers like lawyers and doctors do. This protects victims' ability to collect on bona fide claims, insurance to be paid for by police departments. As a result, any officer who creates too many legal actions will be dropped because of financial pressure by rising insurance rates rather than requiring another officer to cross the blue line. Insurance companies will also demand de-escalation training to lower rates. Third point, municipalities liable for officers' unconstitutional actions overturned with legislation. Monell versus Department of Social Service, Supreme Court Case 436, U.S. 658, which was rendered in 1978, which protected municipalities from unconstitutional actions by the police. This will add skin in the game for cities which have the most direct power to reform policing. Federal laws regarding fourth point, federal laws regarding police misconduct to change standard from willfulness to recklessness, while recklessness still poses a high bar to identify and prosecute police misconduct. It will make it more possible. The fifth point, police unions can be held liable and sued for shielding bad cops, suppressing evidence and testimony to that effect, and for knowingly and recklessly disregarding material evidence that an officer is unfit for or is unfit mentally for a job. The next point, mandatory dashboard and body cams. In the event they are turned off and the incidents resulting in serious injury or death to any suspect or witness, it will be considered a felony punishable by prison unless proof of malfunction. If there is a claim of excessive force or abuse and the cams are off, the first incident will result in a warning, the second will result in a suspension, and the third will result in firing. Cam footage, body and dashboard must be released within a week for incidents which result in death, serious injury, or give rise to charges of excessive force. The next point, the elimination of the no-knock warrant. They are unnecessary as police can secure the scene. The next point, mandatory name tags and affiliation requirements applies to all police and law enforcement authorities at the local, state, and federal level, with non-compliance resulting in disciplinary action. Undercover assignments are not required. Compliance must be approved by a court. The next point, chokeholds, illegal nationwide. This will affect or apply to any maneuver resembling a chokehold or designed to cut off airways to affect an individual's breathing. The next point, whistleblower protection expanded within the active police force or for those enrolled in a police academy. Discouraging officers under 5 years on the job to report bad behavior will be grounds for dismissal. There will be a criminal offense to reveal the identity of a whistleblower. The next point, tampering with evidence results in automatic dismissal from the force. The next point, crime to intentionally withhold expiatory evidence by police or prosecutors. The next point, newly discovered DNA evidence must be immediately considered to reverse wrongful convictions. Not to do so is a crime and applies to police, judges, and prosecutors. Failure to act will come under the Office of Independent Prosecutors, which will be discussed below. Next point, federal database open to public scrutiny, containing all complaints, both internal from the public or related to disciplinary actions. Automatic federal Department of Justice review of any police officer exceeding a predetermined amount of complaints. The next point, once an officer has been fired for cause, that officer can never be rehired. A police officer fired for use of excessive force, violent or inappropriate actions directed at a citizen, non-use of body cams, or any felony are not allowed to be hired in any other jurisdiction. The next point is the creation of the Office of Independent Prosecutors. These prosecutors will solely focus on prosecuting police accused of wrongdoing. This will eliminate the conflict of interest of district attorneys who must charge police, although they have an inherent and unwaverable conflict as they require police testimony to charge other criminals. The next point, attorney generals and district attorneys will no longer accept political contributions or endorsements from law enforcement bodies, especially police unions. The next point, loss of pensions by police officers if they have been convicted of a felony or greater while on the job. The next point, the budget reallocation. Of course, this is the point that is very much in the news. It has been referred as defunding the police. 20% of the 2020 budgets then going forward adjusted to inflation to be dedicated to improving conditions in lower class and black neighborhoods. 20% of all police departments budgets increases will also flow to the community organizations tasked with spending such funds. There should be a residency requirement. 90% of police must live within 25 miles of the jurisdictions they work in. 65% must live within the jurisdiction itself. Police forces should demographically reflect the communities they serve. In the case of partners, at least one lives within the jurisdiction. Next point, mandating a certain number of police department paid hours of community service for all street police and communities they police. Next point, community policing, non-armed personnel set up to handle most cases. These include taking reports for crimes already committed, non-active situations, filing of complaints, non-violent crimes or disputes, disputes between neighbors, etc. Next point, remove the permanent placement of police officers from all grade, middle, and high schools. Next point, domestic abuse. Create domestic abuse services analogous to child protective services. Personnel specifically trained to deal with domestic dispute or domestic abuse will be sent on such calls like CPS calls or child protective services cases. A domestic abuse service member can ask for police backup if they feel the escalation is dangerous and warranted. The next point, the de-escalation of police training. Required training and de-escalation techniques similar to Daytona police training based on the Scotland police procedures and showing cases of police abuse and what is non-acceptable during training. Currently, most police academies only show footage of cop killings and train police in aggressive techniques. A popular saying among police is, "I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. The next point, continuation of training. Training is to be updated every 3 years in use of excessive force and dealing with mentally or disabled ill people. Such training will also include racial sensitivity training and update police on new laws locally and federally. The next point, any police officer who discharges his weapon 5 or more times on the job must go back to the police academy for retraining and take mandatory courses on anger management. This threshold of weapons use can be increased or decreased depending upon jurisdictional averages. The intention is to identify and retrain outliers, as most police officers rarely utilize their guns more than once, if at all. The next point, civil rights history classes should be taught the first month in police academy or other training. These classes should include a history of black codes and Jim Crow laws. The next point, reason for contact. Upon initial contact of any kind with any citizen, officers must state reason for contact when an individual is first approached. The next point, no duty to speak. Police not allowed to escalate a situation merely because a person refuses to talk to police or answer questions without an attorney. The next point, misstating the law by police or suspects not allowed to elicit testimony. Knowingly threatening people with greater charges when the situation dictates gives rise to disciplinary action. When defining knowingly, the standard applied will be what a reasonable police officer should have known. The next point, reduce contact between or doing traffic ticketing. Officers must immediately tell the driver why he or she was pulled over, cannot search a vehicle without an independent warrant. No need for those cited to sign tickets. Efforts made to reduce time and contact between the officer and driver, which benefits both, i.e. digitally limiting contact as technology allows. Tickets issued and sent by mail where possible. If the officer believes the driver is driving recklessly or suspicion of a DUI, they may pull over the car, but pullovers can be challenged by dash cam footage. If the footage does not show cause for concern, the officer can be disciplined. Stealing. Police officers caught stealing from a person's house or vehicle will be charged with double the penalty a non-officer will be charged with for the same crime. Military-grade weapons will not be brandished by the police in public unless gunfire or deadly force is required. Next point, eliminate civil and criminal asset forfeiture if it gives police departments economic incentive to charge crimes which conflict with the goals of serving justice. Only exception is if the assets are related to the crime. Next point, it will be illegal for a police officer to have sex with a detainee or suspect under their charge. It will be considered statutory rape because it is unreasonable to assume consensual sex during a power dynamic. The next point, shoot to wound policy in the event of an unarmed suspect. fleeing suspect that poses an imminent danger only, or if deadly force is unnecessary. And the final point, in all quota-based policing. The next point, more next, is entertainment reform. Entertainment industry and reparations. Mandatory funding of black studios by the largest Hollywood studios, record companies, and television studios and networks to compensate for years of lack of support, stereotyping, and damage to the black culture. Each will be required to fund an amount yearly. Black studios will own and produce content by black creators and will be run primarily by black leadership. Content can be licensed to major studios. For a race to thrive, it must be able to create art that reflects its own views of the world. Racism still runs rampant throughout our society, and Hollywood is proven the instruction manual. The second point, licensing of public airways to broadcast networks such as NBC, Fox, ABC, and CBS and ABC must require black produced content equal to 20% of the total content on the network as measured by time. Time slots must be of similar quality to other content. The same applies with radio stations and to any other media given access to publicly licensed airways by the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. And final point, minimum of 13.4% black cast and crew on all major television and film productions. The crew requirement cannot be waived, but the cast that are overwhelmingly white, black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian can be waived as reasonable for TV shows and films to be more reflective of reality. The next point or next foundation is monuments. Need we talk about monuments? There is two monuments that should have some type of indication of ownerships of slaves. That's the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., and Jefferson's Monument in Washington, D.C. Both of those monuments are national in scope and are seen worldwide, and there should be some. This is not in the document, but it should be. There should be some recognition of the fact that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. There should also be a piece given to on a judge related to George Washington. Monuments and institutions. Eliminate all Confederate statutes rather than destroy them. They are to be kept by the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, or analogous state facilities. They are to be used only in displays and exhibits designed to investigate our racist past. This is not sanitizing our past, as history exists in books and online. There is no need to display monuments of these types, just as we allowed the Saddam Hussein statue to be removed, as well as the Berlin Wall, where doors easily could have been inserted. All uses and displays of Confederate flags on government grounds or on property with public access is illegal. Rename all streets, schools, public structures, towns, scholarships named after Confederate soldiers or leaders. Rename the names of black heroes or white abolitionists. A memorial built in Washington, D.C. to victims of police excessive force resulting in death or permanent disability, analogous to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, in that all the names and ages are included. Black responsibility, the eighth strand. Chronic poverty creates an atmosphere full of negativity, frustration, hopelessness, depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, crime, and violence. These are some of the conditions that plague the black community, which is dealing with the extreme generational poverty. As we begin to gain social and economic equality, it is our duty to clean up ourselves and our community. This contract is a two-way street. As we gain social and economic equality, we must begin to dissolve any bitterness in our hearts for past wrongs. We must become better citizens who are more productive on all levels of American society. We must really step up after we pass the contract with Black America with no more excuse left in the kitty. Our Entertainers should be persuaded to deliver more positive content that leads our youth to make better choices in life. A new pride must develop with these new opportunities, and we must fight against negativity, frustration, hopelessness, depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, crime, and violence. And these points are subtopics: falsifying documentation to establish descent from an enslaved person, punishable as a crime. Black businesses must receive loans per lending reforms. With over 100 employees will employ at least 50% non-black employees. For all Americans, completion of a rehabilitation program for at least 28 days for the first offenses for illegal use of legal drug use or possession. Failure to complete results in imprisonment. Next point: is part of the 20% of diverted police budgets. Community groups will be organized to work with troubled youth and will have a specific mandate to also decrease black violence, other crime, and address gang violence. Community groups will make themselves available to their neighborhoods to provide mentoring and community-based leadership. All Americans guilty of crime and apprehended agree not to unreasonably resist arrest, putting others in danger. And finally, when enrolled in the AGP and other programs designed to assist in education and employment, to meet the requirements expected of all enrollees and to work diligently to succeed. The final point is neo-reconstruction. The case for neo-reconstruction. We are proposing a black agenda, a neo-reconstruction that would empower African Americans economically and educationally, as well as provide justice and equal protection under the law. The marketing of neo-reconstruction. At the end of slavery, the Republican Party took the lead on attempting to fairly and justly integrate African Americans into American life. This was done through a government-led effort called Reconstruction, a period that lasted roughly from the passing of the Reconstruction Act of 1867 to the Compromise of 1877. During that decade of Reconstruction, African Americans were enfranchised, legally given voting and civil rights. Nearly 2,000 African Americans were elected to public office, and the black representation in the South Carolina state legislature was a robust 59%. In 1876, the Republican presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes reached a compromise with the Democratic Party that ceded control of the South to the Democrats, ending Reconstruction and eventually leading to the institution of a Jim Crow era that placed African Americans in a form of de facto slavery for approximately the next 100 years. Had Reconstruction continued, the African American condition and race relations in America would be far beyond what they are today. Recognizing this unfortunately lost opportunity, we propose neo-reconstruction, an aggressive initiative that has the purpose of redressing past wrongs and revitalizing the black community economically, educationally, judicially, and in every other way necessary to ensure that African Americans have full and equal opportunity and status within our country. The two key areas to address in neo-reconstruction is first economics and second education. Economics through the economic impact through the institution and racist enforcement of acts, laws, and policies such as the Homestead Act of 1862, the Social Security Act of 1935, the GI Bill of 1944, and the Federal Housing Administration loan and its related redlinings of the 1930s and 1960s. White Americans were granted advantages and opportunities that African Americans were not. All but 2% of the $120 billion of government-backed mortgage loans were given to whites. This reality undeniably helped create the incredible wealth gap between blacks and whites today. According to the Federal Reserve, the median white household has $171,000 worth of value, has nearly 10 times more wealth than the median black household, which is $17,600. A white person without a high school diploma has nearly as much wealth as a household led by a black person with a bachelor's or advanced degree. a household led by a white person with a high school diploma has more wealth than a household led by a person with a bachelor's or advanced degree. I guess they want to emphasize that. Lingering cost of race-based policies. According to real estate app Redfin, African American families have lost out on at least $212,000 of personal wealth over the last 40 years because their home was redlined. Because of these historic wrongs, masses of African Americans need economic revitalization and relief, including those not limited to more home ownership, less debt, credit, better credit, and higher incomes. Any man or woman who wrongs another in any way and is so unfaithful to the Lord is guilty and must confess the sin they have committed. They must make full restitution for the wrongs they have done and add a fifth of the value to it and give it all to the person they have wronged. Numbers 5:6, Leviticus. Who should receive restitution. Our goal is to propose economic strategies and processes to address the concerns of 40 million living descendants of African slavery or American slavery. As a group, they range from 3 to 5 generations away from this legalized economic atrocity and are certain victims of post-civil rights discrimination such as racial policing and increased cost of court and legal fees, credit discrimination and higher costs of interest, housing market discrimination and depressed home values, job discrimination and persistent wage gaps, mass incarceration and loss of wages, subprime mortgage collapse and race-based exploitation, student debt disparities that are impacted by race. What are the economic targets? To use measurable and fair calculations similar to those suggested above to address the economic implications of the above infractions and to lead the country to a better and more inclusive economic infrastructure. Calculation metrics, compensation for lost wages. Economist Larry Neal calculated the difference between average wage paid to non-black laborers and the expenditures for expenses paid for slaves such as clothing and housing. This calculated to 1.4 trillion in 1983, now estimated between 5.8 trillion with a 5% assumed interest. Compensation to market value of slavery. Confederate Senator Judah Benjamin estimated the market value of the slave to be $4 billion in 1860, compounded to 2019. This would equate to 9.3 trillion with a 5% assumed interest. The Freeman's Bank and Seneca Stone ring scandal. Payments to the descendants of the depositors of the Freeman's Bank due to the fact that the bank leader and the noted Republican politician Henry Cook used the former slave funds during the net financial collapse, and the federal government didn't ensure or support it. The net present value in NPV to account of interest of the capital was approximately $65 million in 2018 dollars. Job discrimination calculation between 1929 and 1969, if you just account for 40% of the wage gap due to race based on labor market discrimination, gains accrued to whites were about $1.6 trillion. Consideration for disbursement, recognizing that the GDP, the gross domestic product of the overall U.S. economy is 20.5 trillion. We are not suggesting the above amounts be dispersed as one-time lump sum payments, which could adversely affect the American economy and treasury functions, not to mention cause staggering inflation. Indeed, the above calculations amounts should be distributed in several forms, including annual cash disbursements over a 10-year period, tax breaks, tax credits, interest-free loans to spur home ownership, and/or funding. The additional proposals made below. Recommended tactics for recommended tactics for distribution or restitution. Mandate that descendants of African American veterans of World War II who were unable to capitalize on the benefits afforded by the GI Bill of 1944-1956 should receive the NPV of those benefits today calculated at a 5% interest rate. Startup fund for asset building grants for home ownership, education, building, startup funds or vouchers for purchase of financial assets, along with a governing body to establish rules and protection for proper allocation of capital for long-term development. Mandate that all American corporations that benefited financially from slavery start management trainee programs for African American college graduates, with the goal of being to increase the number of blacks in management executive positions to one of the equality of the black population, 13%, within a given number of years, and donate a federally mandated percentage of their profits to a black-owned business over a predetermined period of time. Launch a user-friendly national website and app for support in rolling out this plan, along with networking, training, and educational components. Create a pension system for purposes of investment and growth where only interest payments are currently accessible. A variation of this was earlier suggested by Callie House in the 1898 Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association. Make a significant capital investment in financial infrastructure, as currently 70% of African American communities don't even have a branch or bank of any type or are subject to predatory lending. Develop a commission and timeline in which commission will address particular economic infractions over time to bring closure on a case-by-case basis. Create and support endowments to HBCUs, which still educate the majority of black doctors and engineers. Create a transparent reporting mechanism for abuses to the restitution program to ensure systems remain efficient and effective, including federal programs such as the Economic Opportunity Zones and Community Reinvestment Act. Mandate private equity, pension funds, mutual funds, and venture capital funds to divest from privatized prisons and to be accountable for increasing black venture capital allocation from the current 1% to one closer to equity or equality with the black population, 13%, within a given number of years. Mandate corporations to increase the number of blacks in management executive positions to one closer to equality with the black population, 13%, within a given number of years. Mandate corporations through tax incentives or law to spend a percentage of their profits with black-owned businesses over a predetermined period of time. For example, if the tech and banking sector were to spend just 2% of their net profits for the next 2 years, that would equate to $25 billion and $19.4 billion respectively. Forbes 2% solution inside billionaire Robert Smith's bold plan, June 19, 2020. The implementation timeline is use data gathering for between 2020 and 2021, the entire year, and begin phase 1 payments in 2022. The final point of this neo-reconstruction is education spending, and we are going to conclude include the contract with Black America with that point. Race-based spending, according to Real Estate Act Redland. Moved in. Education spending. Many of our hearts are being called to a new level of commitment in the fight against racial justice. As a nation and as individuals, it's not always easy to know how to invest in a change we long to see. One of the most impactful ways to make a difference is to address the inequalities in education. For example, predominantly white public school districts K-12 receive $23 billion more funding than school districts that are predominantly non-white, according to Ed Bill. Even when adjusted for income levels, white students receive roughly $1,500 more per year than non-white students. Black students face more challenges in the U.S. public education system and higher education. Innovative policy change, financing, and equal access to quality learning and leadership development and opportunities are necessary to increase the level of racial equity in our country and achieve greatness. Race-based spending. According to real estate at Redland, African Americans, due to spending differentials, African Americans receive significantly lower education. Even in 2020, educational spending was a key metric used to argue the pivotal Brown versus the Board of Education case. Predominantly white students per spending $13,908. Predominantly minority students $11,682. Total average per student $13,118. Increased educational metrics. Increased educational opportunities and empowered institutions are must if African Americans are to approach anything resembling racial equality. Historically, black colleges and universities fit both the educational and historic institutional criteria, so strengthening these schools must be foremost in any neo-reconstruction plan. HBCUs, however, are woefully underfunded, and any sincere attempt to improve black America's post-educational or post-secondary educational opportunities must include bolstering their financial outlooks. For instance, the total endowment of all 102 HBCUs combined is $2.1 billion. That's slightly more than 5% of the approximately $40 billion endowment of Harvard University alone. In fact, 54 predominantly white institutions, many, if not most, of which are profited greatly from slavery, have endowed